Nel precedente video abbiamo ascoltato un'affascinante intervista al pilota di aerei cargo Eric Delgado. Delgado ha incontrato un UFO mentre volava in Messico e lo ha ripreso con il suo cellulare. I video girati dal comandante Delgado hanno una buona definizione e sono decisamente affascinanti. Oggi vedremo un'intervista e delle slide create da John Ramirez, un ex dipendente CIA, ora in pensione, di livello GS-15, che è il massimo livello per i dipendenti CIA civili. GS è l'acronimo per General Schedule. Il 71% dei dipendenti CIA sono GS e 15 è il livello vero e proprio, che va da 1 a 15. In pratica indica un direttore CIA, un analista, ma non una carica politica, e neanche un militare. In pratica quindi un classico white collar americano. John Ramirez era l'uomo dei radar a terra. Tutti i radar. Americani, russi, degli alleati, inclusi quelli per intercettare i missili ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, i missili con testata atomica che potrebbero essere lanciati dai russi. La presentazione è divisa in due. La prima parte riguarda la struttura della CIA, che è un argomento interessante visto che non sappiamo molto a riguardo. La seconda invece è sulle tecnologie radar, UFO e avvistamenti. Vi ricordiamo che i primi 6 video sono fondamentali per capire che cos'è la disclosure e cosa sta succedendo con gli avvistamenti UFO negli Stati Uniti e in Italia. Questa è l'ultima intervista di questa miniserie tecnica, che comprende i video dal 7 al 13. Il prossimo video non sarà un'intervista, ma una collezione di video e immagini di avvistamenti. Vi consigliamo di iscrivervi al canale per non perdervi il prossimo video. Inoltre, per poter intervistare noi diretti interessati, abbiamo la necessità di avere un numero maggiore di iscritti. Quindi se volete vedere delle interviste fatte da noi, iscrivetevi al canale e condividete il video. John Ramirez non è un whistleblower. È autorizzato a parlare dalla CIA. È un prolifico produttore di slide e inoltre ha visto una sfera luminosa, il che lo trasforma in un testimone. Sicuramente torneremo su di lui in futuro, perché le sue dichiarazioni sono affascinanti, a tratti inquietanti, ricche di dettagli, e sia tecniche che metafisiche. Ma sentiamolo in prima persona riguardo questi avvistamenti e le tecnologie implicate.
And the fact that the CIA allowed me to say what I did, I was really surprised. So, and I got more to say. There's a few slides I'm going to expand on for a future presentation. I'm trying my darnest to try to get redacted, and I haven't succeeded. So there's a few slides there about the McMinnville UFO and the reality of, I would say, hybridization that I thought would get redacted, but it didn't. And that's the word that Louis Elizondo can't say, that everyone in the Pentagon is expecting him to say someday, is that we're all hybrids.
When you say that Lou can't say that, is that actually
it's a schedule.
Right. Okay.
It's a schedule. I think the biggest takeaway for folks to understand is that things are happening on a, it's not a disclosure, it's a scheduled dissemination. And so certain things have to be set up before other things can be revealed. I think the kicker would be this James Webb Space Telescope.
Oh, yeah?
I think it's going to look at something and it's going to be so phenomenal that the government would have no choice but to say, oh, look at that, and we need to go look at it, even though they know what it is.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that it could be the case that they're setting up this telescope with the prior knowledge that they're going to reveal something.
They need to look at someplace, yeah,
That's
in space, and then there will be some kind of reveal there, because they couldn't explain the orbs, and they said, okay, these aren't the saucers. These aren't your grandfather's saucers. You know, these orbs are different. And that's what really got everyone excited, is the presence of these orbs. That's where most of the focus is on now. It's more of an overview of what America's intelligence agencies do, but with a focus on UFO, UAP investigations by the US government. This is a very important slide, because what this slide says is nothing in this presentation contains classified information and can be shared or published. So that's why I'm sharing it with everyone who is watching today. And they don't endorse what I say, and they don't even admit that anything I say is true or false. So it gives the government some leeway in kind of distancing themselves from what I might say. But this is very standard for anyone at CIA writing a book or a memoir or even a slide presentation like this. And they did not in any way tailor my presentation. They received it cold. They looked at it, analyzed it. I believe they sent it further up into government since it relates to UFOs and UAPs. And there was nothing there that was classified. So here we go. There are 18 agencies in the US intelligence community. These are the three mission areas in the ODNI: counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and counterintelligence. I was in the National Counterproliferation Center, but most people know the National Counterterrorism Center. There are 18 members in the intelligence community, but 5 are more equal than others, let's say. And these are listed in the order that legislation founded them. CIA was founded in 1947. It's always the agency. Members of the IC get annoyed that we always call ourselves the agency, but we are the agency. We founded in 47. The fort is what we call the National Security Agency. And all of these agencies were founded due to some perception of a failure or the lack of some capability. 1952 was the middle of the Korean War. The Chinese entered the Korean War. It was believed that it was a failure of communications intelligence to be able to indicate and warn that the Chinese were going to enter the Korean War. So Congress set up a dedicated agency to collect signals, and that became the National Security Agencies. Took out that function out of CIA, gave it to the NSA. During the 50s, there was a battle between the Air Force and the CIA as to who owned the skies in terms of reconnaissance. The CIA, of course, as you know, had the U-2 aircraft. The Air Force, particularly Strategic Air Command under Curtis LeMay, he was touting the B-66 bomber, converting that into an intelligence collecting craft. And there were fierce battles between the two. So Congress created the National Reconnaissance Office to blend in both U.S. Air Force equities and CIA equities in intelligence from the air and space. And they're called Westfields or the Towers or Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal because at one time the NRO had the most plush building in the intelligence community, if not the federal government. They had like some of the nicest facilities, but that's no longer true. And so now we have the DIA, were founded in 1961. So we don't call it the DIA, everyone calls it the DIAC. So they are a military intelligence agency in the sense that they look at what other foreign governments are doing in terms of military capabilities and assess what our hardware might stack up against their hardware. The NGA, which in my opinion is the most important of the agencies in terms of UAP research, was actually part of CIA from a long time ago. It was called the National Photographic Interpretation Center. General Schwarzkopf in the first Gulf War complained loudly, Congress heard, that the warfighter was not getting adequate imagery intelligence from the CIA. Congress then took that function away, joined it with a defense function for mapping, and that eventually became the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, in 2003. And Crystal Palace is sort of like an informal name. If you saw their headquarters, you can see why they call it the Crystal Palace. So of the 4 big agencies, they're functional mission managers for various intelligence disciplines. We have human intelligence at CIA, and that's well known because human intelligence is about recruiting spies from other countries to report what they're doing to us. They also have open source intelligence, or OSINT. That term has become very popular. NSA has SIGINT. The director of NSA, internally, we call it DERNSA, never the director of NSA. So internally we say DERNSA, and everyone knows that means the director. Now, measurement and signature intelligence became very popular most recently because they're the folks who specialized in the sensors that were collecting information at Skinwalker Ranch. And DIA has the functional mission manager responsibility for MASINT. And I've already mentioned NGA having geospatial intelligence. NRO is just is the mission enabler. They designed the sensor systems to collect against all of those other 5 intelligence disciplines from space. Now, if you follow my cursor here, this is where you get the most detailed imagery. It's straight down. We call this nadir, straight from the telescope right down to the Earth. That is the most useless imagery you can collect, because it doesn't do any good to look at the roof of the building. You want to be able to measure the building, how high it is and how wide it is. So most of the time we look over here, not straight down, so we get an angle to whatever object we're looking at. Now out here, the imagery is very poor, and that's what you see on Google Earth. Very poor imagery, like a meter pixel resolution, whereas the actual capability is like 1/3 of a meter, 30 centimeters. Now, wouldn't it be great to be able to get on Google Earth and be able to see what your house looks like right there and walk outside and see yourself waving at the satellite? Can't do that because what Google supplies is historic data, a snapshot in time that may have been taken a year ago, 6 months ago, maybe 2 years ago. It's going to be very dated imagery. Not so with NRO. For $300 million per year, you too can get 24/7 on-demand imagery from anywhere on Earth to monitor anything on Earth. And this is the Crystal Palace. This is the headquarters of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in Springfield, Virginia. If you see pictures of it, and there are pictures inside released, it is tremendous building. It's very ornate inside. It's just amazing, this building that they built for NGA. It is the most important agency for UAP research, because as we know, the UAPs are like visual phenomena. They're lights, orbs, or craft. CIA doesn't take pictures, NSA doesn't take pictures, DIA doesn't take pictures. NRO has satellites that take pictures, but where do those pictures go? They go to NGA. Now let's look at some Space Force stuff here. Russia has had Space Forces for a long time. It's part of the Russian Aerospace Forces. I found an interesting quote from a Russian officer, Sergei Brezhnev, and he said, "We are unfortunately not ready to fight extraterrestrial civilizations." And he said that in all seriousness to a question posed by Russian media. So there's a phenomenon that occurred in the Soviet Union in the town of Petrozavodsk, a town in the Soviet Union where some dock workers saw a huge star-like ball of light flashing out of the dark sky. You can read it there. Spread out like a jellyfish. There's a picture of what it looked like. It hovered over the city. There happened to be a TASS news agency reporter present, and I believe that may have been sourced to that news agency reporter. But it was seen by police officers, sailors, and an ambulance crew as eyewitnesses, as well as just normal everyday citizens. UPI then took that report and then published it here in the US. Russians report UFO like star over city. James Oberg is a NASA engineer, and he believed that the Petrozavodsk phenomenon was a test of the fractional orbital bombardment system. Well, the last time, now keep in mind that this happened in 1977. The last time the Soviet Union tested the FOBS or FOBS system was in 1971, 6 years prior. They abandoned the program. So you can't attribute what was seen here to this fractional orbital bombardment system. And it was studied by both Soviet scientists and the US intelligence community. Both on the Soviet side and the US side, we observed that there was an association with a certain missile, the SS-20 Sabre, which was an intermediate range ballistic missile. This missile was designed for NATO countries. It was designed to be deployed from the US to strike targets in NATO as part of a European war, a nuclear war in NATO. It was not designed to reach across the ocean. It was not an ICBM. It could not have touched the US, but our allies would have been at risk. So every time the Russians, well, not every time, but many times when the Russians would test the SS-20 Sabre, here comes these domes of light. They thought the dome of light could be a missile countermeasure to obscure the numbers and trajectories of a Soviet nuclear missile attack. There are domes of light associated with more recent Russian missiles, the SS-25 and 27 Topol and Topol-M. They did use similar technology to evaluate missile countermeasures, but the phenomenon we know as Petrozavodsk was 8 years earlier than this first test launch of these missiles, and the SS-20 tests that occurred much earlier than these missiles. The Avangard, which is the Russian hypersonic glide vehicle, can fly at Mach 27, and it creates a kind of a plasma field around it. As it skirts the upper atmosphere, it carries up to a 2 megaton warhead. And so there was no such thing when the Petrozavodsk phenomenon occurred 4 decades earlier. Okay, so let's look at some DoD collection. ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There are several ISR craft, and we're going to talk about Corporal Ball. And a pilot of the Corporal Ball, who's now a respected scholar of military aviation history, he gave a first-person account. When he was the pilot or flying the Corporal Ball aircraft, he described a translucent milky white wall of light from the ground all the way up as far as he could see out of the cockpit window, and it radiated at 6,200 miles per hour outward. The Cobra Ball was designed to collect against Russian missile tests over Kamchatka. That's where it flies. And unfortunately, this is the plane that the Russians mistook when it shot down the Korean airliner. They thought they were going after Cobra Ball. Instead, they tragically shot down the Korean airliner. The WC-135 is not a weather plane. It is an ISR aircraft, and its job is to collect radionucleotides, nuclear particles suspended in the atmosphere, especially after a suspected nuclear test. In fact, they can still collect signatures from very old nuclear tests. You can still collect and determine what test it was from by breaking out the 18 components of radionuclide that can tell you the mixture or the formula of that nuclear device, and they can then correlate it to something that occurred in the past. So they're still up there. Junvalo Melchizedek, a spiritual visionary, esoteric researcher, wrote a book in 2003 called Living in the Heart. And in it, he, on page 50, he described an interesting conversation he had with a major in the Air Force. And the major in the Air Force, she said, the satellites could see a person's light body, that is the Merkaba field, as a person creates one through a meditative practice that Melchizedek teaches, in fact, that it creates so much energy in the person's light body that it can be seen in space. And she relates that the military was concerned about the creation of these light bodies. They didn't know what it was, but they now know it's part of a new consciousness that is unfolding on Earth at this time. I take Melchizedek's word at his word. I mean, I can't dispute something that I wasn't there to either say or not say that was true, but I take him at his word that this happened. So I think it's interesting that that the Air Force major said this to Melchizedek, and that's a person that I think people should interview and say exactly, you know, what else did the major tell you? There are 2 satellites that could do this, are the Defense Support Program satellites, the DSP, and the newer SIBRs, or space-based infrared system. The DSP program is fading away. They're very old satellites, and they'll eventually be replaced by SIBRs as the constellation for launch detection. The Russians also collected against the dome of lights using radars, or collected against UAPs, in fact. There was an interview with a Major General Alexeyev, and he said that the Soviet leadership actually ordered that certain devices, such as theodolites, which is basically just an instrumented telescope, a ranged instrumentation telescope, and radar stations, be used to make contact. And the special military loads, these are the missile launches that carry not real warheads, but dummy warheads. And when the Russians would launch one of these missiles with a dummy warhead, UAPs would show up. These objects were recorded in instrumented data because these radars are very good at detecting reentry vehicles from Russian missiles. So they're very good at looking at very fast, very small objects traveling at great speeds. And it's not classified to say that, for example, within the Russian capabilities also, there was a Mark 21 warhead that was associated with the Peacekeeper ICBM, which is no longer in service. And the Air Force released some information about it. That warhead, the reentry vehicle, actually enters the atmosphere at 7.9 kilometers per second. And these radars have no trouble whatsoever tracking that. This is called the Neiman P. The left side is a transmitter, the right side is a receiver. And it was seen tracking anomalous phenomenon. In fact, the Russians say we use this radar to track anomalous phenomenon. And they gave a lot of information about this. So I can say in general terms that this is an S-band radar. And S-band means 2 gigahertz to 4 gigahertz as radar frequencies. It works somewhere in that range of frequencies. There's another interesting radar, I believe, that is the AN-SPY-1 radar, the Aegis fire control radar, that also is an S-band radar. And so the Navy guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I'm accurate in saying that the SPY-1 radar on the USS Princeton operated in that frequency range that this Neiman P radar operated in. The Pechora ballistic missile early warning radar system of radars in the periphery of the Soviet Union, and they're there to look for ballistic missile launches from the US. A ballistic missile early warning, that's what it is. They also can detect satellites and compare the satellites to known ephemeris or known orbital paths of those satellites and identify them. Well, sometimes they collected things that they could not identify, and they weren't missiles. They thought they were missiles, and they went to a high state of readiness. But they were not missiles, and they realized they were not missiles. And they continued to collect or detect certain types of objects like that, which were of interest to the Soviet leadership and the Russian leadership. Radars operated in VHF. Let's say between 100 and 200 megahertz. That's what the best I can give you, because they're still, like, the exact frequencies are sensitive. How about China? This is another satellite, another slide that I thought would be redacted. It's not known but discoverable that the CIA had these collection sites in Iran. Even through the early periods of the Islamic Republic of Iran, these collection sites existed, but we lost them in '79 when Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, when he discovered that the government of Iran changed hands, he said, "What about those CIA guys up there in the north?" And he said that in a public way. And that embarrassed the Iranian government, and so we were kicked out of the country. Otherwise, I think we would still been fine there. But we got kicked out, and these collection facilities were there to collect intelligence on Soviet ICBM and missile tests from the mountains of northern Iran. So without them, where do we go? Well, we approach China. That's right, the People's Republic of China, our erstwhile adversary. We approached them with a proposal that we build these collection facilities on their territory, close enough to the Soviet border so that we get a good view of the missile launches and the missile impacts. And the Chinese agreed. I listed the sources of that information, the open sources of that information. It leaked fairly early, but we never acknowledged it. Now we do now acknowledge that there was such a program where CIA technical officers from the Directorate of Science and Technology worked with the Chinese counterparts in the People's Liberation Army side by side, collecting against Russian missiles. Authorized transfer of intelligence information because our target was the Soviet Union. I don't know what the status of that program is, but there were sensors there that could have tracked the domes of light, and we briefed them on everything. They wanted to know everything, what we put in their country. We had to tell them this is for this and that's for that. And so they knew about UAPs. They also had some indication, I believe, that these things were flying over their skies before we showed up. But nothing happens in China unless it's sanctioned by the Communist Party. You cannot have a MUFON in China unless the Communist Party says you can have a MUFON in China. So the UFO China Society was there to continue scientific studies. So they were informed that these are real, and likely informed by us, the CIA. Now let's go to the Galactic Federation. And as you can see, I'm just jumping all over the place because I want to cover a lot of things. Eshed is not a NASA guy in Israel. A lot of folks thought he's this NASA guy, like the NASA administrator of Israel. He wasn't. He's closer to being the counterpart to the director of NRO. And he, as you know, made these statements about the existence of a galactic federation and the fact that the US government knows about the existence of the Galactic Federation. And it was remote viewed, January 13, 1988. And there's the URL if you want to pull that up. In the notes, it said that the interviewer or facilitator was ED and the remote viewer was MR. So ED could have been Major Ed Dames. You know him from being a frequent guest on Coast to Coast AM. And MR is likely to have been the late Mel Riley. It's a fascinating report of being led into a chamber and having robed figures all around and having to lie down on a table to be examined. Did Roswell really happen? Well, this is Chase Brandon. He was a very senior officer in CIA. He was in the Director of Operations part of CIA, and that's publicly known. And he wrote a book called Crypto's Conundrum. And it's about his take on what happened at Roswell, but he went way back. He went back to Atlantis. He traced it all the way through a character he called Chalmers, who had past lives in these various eras in Earth history, going back to the city of Atlantis. And there are some interesting details in here. Now, Chase originally he talked to the press about discovering the files about Roswell, and he stated publicly on the air that there was a crash and there were bodies and there were not human bodies. So he stated that. And CIA heard that and said, Chase, you can't say that. You can't just go on the air and say that. So Chase said, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book. And so he wrote a book. Well, if you read the book, I mean, he says some things, many things of significance. For example, that these UFOs start from the water, fly out into the sky, and come back into the water. And that they're called USOs when they do that. And he wrote this back in 2012. So I found that to be interesting that he would say that. But he says that the cover-up was about hiding the fact that there were alien forces on the earth and that there were ancestors of Atlantis on the earth, and the government knows about this. That was his whole thing about the book. So read the book and just hold it lightly. It is more of a science fiction book, but this guy was kind of informed. So what was that organization running around the world trying to find evidence of hybrid civilizations? It was the Deutsches Annenerbe. They investigate the supposed occult hidden of the German race. Occult does not mean demonic, it just means hidden. They wanted to link the German ancestry of the Aryan race to the inhabitants of Atlantis. And they believe that when Atlantis was destroyed, that the survivors of Atlantis spread across the earth. To the New World, for example, they went everywhere looking for the survivors of Atlantis. They went, strangely enough, to the Antarctic, looking for evidence, artifacts that they existed. Did they find them? I don't know. But they supported these expeditions. They were into these occult practices, psychic phenomenon, and unfortunately tragically conducted these human genetic experiments in the concentration camps. Experiment with DNA. And here's a picture of them with Tibetan dignitaries in Lhasa in 1938. So how are you going to hide all of this from becoming public? Well, one way is to create an intelligence agency. And at that time, in January of 1946, now mind you, May of 1945, we have Nazi SS officers assisting the US government with finding information that's in the Nazi archives. Some of that information was regard to their research into Atlantean civilizations and to breakaway civilizations, advanced human hybrids. And how do you hide that? Well, you need an intelligence organization called the Central Intelligence Group, which was founded in January of 1946. The beginning of the year in 1946. And its purpose was to hide the association of the US government and these former Nazi officers. And they classified the exploitation of advanced technology gleaned from the Nazi archives. And this creation of this National Intelligence Authority and this Central Intelligence Group was the birth of the modern national security state. Whereas Paperclip brought over 1,600 Nazis, 1,000 of those Nazis actually worked for CIG and later CIA. They were spies for the CIA. And we sent them back into Europe, spy against the Russians. They were more easily able to assimilate into East European countries. And of course, the famous one was General Reinhard Gehlen, was sent back to help establish the West German Intelligence Service, BND.